My children thought I was a senile grandmother they could easily rob, but they had no idea I was the queen of an empire built on secrets that could bury them alive. They spent months plotting to steal my fortune, never realizing that while they were setting their traps, I was busy orchestrating their descent into a decades-long nightmare. My children always whispered behind my back, their voices laced with that impatient, predatory edge that only grows when someone is eyeing a fortune they haven't earned. I am 72, a woman who built an empire from a single rundown bakery, and for the last decade, I have been treated not as a mother, but as a ticking clock. My daughter, Clara, and my son, Elias, operated with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. They didn't even bother to hide the fact that they were tracking my bank statements. They'd show up at my estate unannounced, eyes scanning the living room as if calculating the resale value of my antiques, their pleasantries feeling like sandpaper against my skin. I knew exactly what they were discussing behind closed doors. They thought I was losing my edge, that my mind was softening with age. They spoke about conservatorship and protecting the estate, but the words were mere masks for their desperation. Elias had debts that were starting to look like a mountain, and Clara's high society lifestyle was burning through her trust fund at a rate that would have made a sailor blush. They were restless, tired of waiting for nature to take its course. But they didn't realize that while they were busy plotting my demise, I was busy orchestrating a masterpiece of my own. The turning point came on a Tuesday, the kind of dreary, overcast day that makes you feel like the walls are closing in. I had caught them in the study, their voices raised just enough for me to hear from the hallway. "She's not giving up the password to the holding company," Clara hissed, her voice vibrating with a cocktail of greed and genuine anger. "If we don't move now, the auditors will find the discrepancies in the payroll, and then we're finished. We need the signature on the transfer papers by the end of the week, or we're going to be facing a massive inquiry into where that money went." Elias laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "So what's the plan? We can't just force her. If we push too hard, she'll change the will and leave it all to charity. We have to make her look incompetent. We need to create a situation where she's seen as a liability to her own finances." I stood in the shadows, my hand resting on the heavy oak doorframe. I didn't feel hurt. I felt a cold, crystalline clarity. They didn't just want my money. They wanted to strip me of my dignity, to lock me away in some sterile facility so they could feast on the carcass of my life's work. They were prepared to ruin me, to use every manipulation in the book, just to secure their next payday. They even hinted at involving outsiders, whispers of a specialist who could handle delicate situations, a person who knew how to make people disappear from public life without a trace. It was a terrifying realization. My own flesh and blood had crossed the line from greed into something far more predatory, something that felt dangerously close to a calculated attempt to break my life. I walked away from the study before they could see me, my heart beating with a steady, calculated rhythm. I went to my office and pulled a manila folder from the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, a space they didn't even know existed. Inside was not a will, but a dossier. I had spent the last 2 years quietly documenting every move they made. I had logs of their meetings, copies of the forged documents they'd already tried to push through, and recorded transcripts of their conversations. I even had proof of the shadow network they were trying to cultivate to intimidate me. But that wasn't the surprise. The surprise was what I had put in motion 3 months ago. I had invited a very specific guest to dinner, a person who was currently sitting in my parlor waiting for my cue. My children wanted me to look incompetent. They wanted to claim I was losing my mind. I was going to give them exactly that, but with a twist they would never see coming. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of iced tea, and took a deep breath. It was time to invite them in for the last family dinner they would ever attend. As I walked toward the dining room, I saw them sitting at the long mahogany table, already pouring wine and laughing about a future where they were finally in control. They stopped talking the moment I stepped into the light. I sat at the head of the table, folded my hands, and smiled the smile of a predator. "Children," I said, my voice steady and cold, "I've decided to sign the papers, but before I do, there's someone in the other room I'd like you to meet." Clara looked at Elias, her eyes widening with a mix of triumph and confusion. They were so blinded by the prize that they didn't notice the strange look on my face or the silence emanating from the rest of the house. I stood up and signaled toward the hallway. A man stepped out from the shadows of the foyer, not a lawyer, but someone wearing a uniform that made the blood drain from Elias's face instantly. It was a senior investigator from the Service of Internal Verification, and he wasn't here to discuss my finances. He was here to discuss the illegal activity my children had been participating in for the last 6 months. As the front door clicked shut and locked with a heavy, final sound, I leaned over and whispered, "Did you really think you were the only ones playing a game?" The blood drained from Elias's face so rapidly, he looked like a wax mannequin left too close to a fire. Clara, usually the quickest to recover, stood up so abruptly her chair screeched against the hardwood, a sound like a dying animal. The investigator stepped forward, his expression neutral, devoid of any sympathy. He didn't reach for a badge. He didn't need to. He simply held up a tablet that displayed a live feed of their private offshore accounts, the ones they thought were shielded by layers of encryption and ghost companies. "Elias, Clara," the investigator said, his voice clipped and professional, "we've been monitoring the digital trail of your recent business ventures. It seems you've been funneling money through an organized scheme that links directly back to several blocked entities. This has escalated far beyond a simple family dispute over an inheritance. This is now a matter of national financial security." I watched them crumble. It was fascinating, really. How quickly the bravado of the entitled dissolves when they realize the walls aren't just closing in, but are actually made of steel. They had spent the last year thinking they were the hunters, setting traps for their aging mother, all the while oblivious to the fact that I was feeding information directly to the Service of Internal Verification. Every bribe they offered, every specialist they reached out to, every forged document. I had documented it all and handed it over on a silver platter. "Mom, what is this?" Clara stammered, her voice thin and reedy. "This is a mistake. We were just trying to manage your assets. You're confused. You don't know who this man is." I didn't answer her. I didn't have to. The investigator stepped closer, his gaze locked onto Elias. "Your mother isn't confused, Miss Clara. In fact, she's been the primary source of our intelligence for months. We have recordings of your intent to commit fraud, and more importantly, your attempt to source illegal weapons through a black market contact to remove obstacles from your path. That adds a heavy, dangerous charge to your file, an attempt to break a life through criminal conspiracy." Elias turned on me, his eyes wide with a manic, desperate rage. "You set us up. You brought them here. You're trying to send your own children to face an enormous, decades-long sentence just to keep your money?" I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my dress with agonizing slowness. I walked over to the sideboard and picked up a crystal flute of champagne, swirling the golden liquid. "You never understood the nature of my business," I whispered, stepping into his personal space. "You saw a bakery. I saw a global logistics network. You thought I was getting old, so you decided to steal the keys to the kingdom. But you forgot one thing. I built this empire while dodging people far more dangerous than you, and I never, ever lose." I looked at the investigator and nodded. "Take them. The evidence is in the study, just as we discussed." As the officers moved in, the house, the sanctuary I had built, suddenly felt like a cold, hollow shell. Clara began to scream, a shrill, piercing sound of pure denial, while Elias went eerily quiet, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an exit that didn't exist. They were being led toward the front door, their hands cuffed behind their backs, their faces flushed with the sudden, violent reality of their ruined futures. Just as they reached the threshold, Elias stopped and looked back at me. A slow, terrifying grin spread across his face, a look that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the look of a defeated man. It was the look of someone who had a secret card still tucked in his sleeve. "You think you've won, Mother," he rasped, his voice trembling with a mixture of malice and triumph. "You think you're so clever hiding behind your investigators? You have no idea what we found in your private safe last night. You think we only wanted the money. You have no idea what kind of monster you've actually been hiding in your own basement. My blood ran ice cold. I had accounted for everything, the money, the forgeries, the threats, but I hadn't accounted for the one thing I kept locked in the cellar, a secret I hadn't even told my own lawyers. As the heavy doors shut behind them, the sound echoing like a gunshot, I heard a sudden, distinct thud coming from beneath the floorboards of the kitchen. The sound of someone or something trying to break out. The sound echoed through the floorboards, a rhythmic, hollow thud that seemed to vibrate directly into the soles of my shoes. It wasn't the sound of pipes settling or the wind rattling the old bones of this estate. It was purposeful. It was a rhythmic demand for attention. My heart, which had been a steady, icy drumbeat of triumph just moments before, suddenly stuttered. I had been so focused on the chessboard of my children's greed that I had allowed my own perimeter to be breached. I stood in the center of the dining room, the silence of the house pressing against my ears. The investigator and his team were gone, taking Clara and Elias into the cold, gray reality of detention. But the echo of Elias's last words lingered like a curse. The monster in the basement. How could he have known? The safe in the study was a decoy, a collection of ledgers and documents meant to satisfy a prying eye. But the real vault, the one that held the history of my early ruthless years, was reinforced concrete hidden beneath the foundation. I had kept the key, a heavy, cold iron piece, around my neck for 40 years. I turned toward the kitchen, my movements stiff, my mind racing. If Elias had broken into the lower levels, he hadn't just found financial records. He had found the truth. I had spent a lifetime scrubbing my past, painting over the stained glass of my origins with layers of philanthropic work and legitimate commerce. But the truth was a persistent rot. If he had accessed the chamber, he hadn't just seen my history. He had seen the one person I had spent my entire adult life trying to keep buried. The thuds intensified. I reached the cellar door, a heavy iron-bound piece of oak that looked like it belonged in a cathedral, not a suburban mansion. I didn't reach for the key immediately. Instead, I pulled a small silver-plated piece of security equipment from my pocket. Not a weapon, but a remote trigger. I had installed a fail-safe years ago, a system designed to flood the lower chamber with a fast-acting, incapacitating gas if anyone unauthorized ever managed to bypass the structural integrity of the vault. But as my thumb hovered over the button, a distorted voice crackled through the intercom system I hadn't realized was still active. "Don't bother, Mother. I already disabled your little ventilation system." My blood turned to slush. Elias. He hadn't been arrested. He had stalled them. He had manipulated the situation to get the police out of the house, perhaps by claiming he had left evidence of a larger, more dangerous organized scheme elsewhere. He was still here. "You think you're the only one who learned how to manipulate a system?" His voice continued, echoing through the empty halls, seemingly coming from everywhere at once. "You taught us to be hungry, to be smart, to be ruthless. You just forgot that eventually the cubs decide the lioness has grown too slow. I didn't just find the records, Mom. I found him, and I think he's been waiting a very, very long time to have a conversation with you." I felt the air in the kitchen shift. The temperature plummeted, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up as I heard the distinct metallic click-clack of a lock being undone from the other side of the cellar door. The heavy barrier, designed to keep the world out, began to swing inward with a slow, agonizing groan of rusted hinges. I backed away, my hands trembling as I reached into my coat, clutching the only defense I had left. The light from the cellar was dim, casting a long, jagged shadow that stretched across the kitchen tiles, climbing the walls like a living, reaching limb. A figure emerged from the darkness, hunched and shrouded in the dust of decades. It wasn't Elias. It was someone I hadn't seen since the night I left my old life behind in a burning warehouse on the edge of the city. The figure stepped into the light, and I found myself staring into the face of a man who was supposed to be nothing more than a memory, a ghost I had convinced myself I'd destroyed. He wasn't dead. He was standing there, staring at me with eyes that held the same predatory, cold intelligence that I had passed on to my children. He was holding a remote of his own, and behind him, through the doorway, I saw the true extent of the damage. The basement walls had been completely breached, and beyond them the house was rigged with something that looked suspiciously like volatile, unstable components of an organized weapon network. He smiled, revealing teeth stained by years of darkness. "You played a good game, Elena, but you always did underestimate the people you left for dead. Now tell me, where is the rest of the fortune? Because if you don't start talking, I'm going to make sure your precious mansion and everything you've spent your life building becomes nothing but ash." The house groaned under the weight of the explosives he'd clearly planted while I was busy dealing with the police. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting my children. I was fighting my own past, and it had finally come back to collect the debt. The floor beneath us shuddered, and I knew that if I made one wrong move, the entire foundation would collapse, burying us all in the secret I had spent a lifetime trying to hide. The silence that followed his ultimatum was absolute, save for the rhythmic, steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound that usually brought me comfort, but now felt like a countdown to my annihilation. I looked at the man before me, the specter of my own early recklessness. He was ragged, his clothes hanging off his frame like wet paper, but his grip on the detonation trigger was steady. He was no longer the man I had outsmarted decades ago. He was a desperate animal, and those are the only ones you truly cannot predict. "You're a ghost," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I saw you fall. I saw the ceiling collapse." "I crawled out," he rasped, his voice sounding like grinding gravel. "It took me 20 years to find where you buried yourself, Elena, and I didn't come back for your money. I came for the satisfaction of watching you lose it all." My mind raced. I couldn't reach for my own defense. He was too close, his reflexes sharpened by a life of vengeance. But then my eyes shifted. Beyond him, in the dim light of the cellar doorway, I saw a flicker of movement, a shadow detaching itself from the darkness. It was Elias. He hadn't left. He had been watching, waiting for the perfect moment to interject, clearly thinking he could play the savior or take control of the situation himself. He was foolish, arrogant, and entirely unprepared for the level of violence this stranger possessed. Elias lunged forward, likely thinking he could tackle the man and secure the fortune for himself. It was the move of an amateur. The stranger didn't even flinch. He simply shifted his weight, pivoted, and caught Elias by the throat, pinning him against the cellar doorframe with a strength that was unnatural. "Stay out of this, boy," the man hissed. "You're just the collateral damage of a legacy built on lies." That split second of distraction was the only window I needed. I didn't reach for a weapon. I reached for the hidden panel on the wall, the one that controlled the building's specialized fire suppression and structural stabilization system. It wasn't designed to put out fires. It was a high-pressure chemical foam system I'd installed for a different contingency entirely. I slammed my palm onto the red override switch. The room exploded in a hiss of white, pressurized chemical vapor. It wasn't fire, but it was suffocating. Within seconds, the air became thick, blinding, and impossible to breathe. The stranger stumbled back, his vision obscured, the trigger slipping from his hand. Elias fell to the floor, gasping for air as the foam coated everything. I didn't hesitate. I vaulted over the kitchen island, grabbed the remote he had dropped, and didn't just deactivate it. I initiated a remote hard reset of the entire property's security grid. A high-frequency pulse screamed through the house, a sound so sharp it shattered every window in the kitchen. The stranger collapsed, clutching his ears, his body racked by the intense acoustic feedback. I stood over him, my composure finally shattering, replaced by a cold, tectonic resolve. "You should have stayed buried," I told him, as the automated system flooded the room with a heavier, sedative gas that I kept for emergencies. As he slumped into unconsciousness, his eyes locked onto mine one last time, not with hate, but with a terrifying realization that he had underestimated me again. The police, alerted by the structural alarm I had triggered, arrived within minutes. When they breached the kitchen, they found me sitting at the dining table sipping that same glass of cold tea. The house was a wreck, but the secrets of the basement were effectively neutralized. My children were already being processed at the station for their attempted fraud and criminal conspiracy, and this intruder, a man from a past I had successfully hidden, was whisked away into the custody of the Service of Internal Verification. They never found out about the true history in the cellar, just as I never let them find the hidden offshore accounts that remained untouched. When the dust settled, the estate was sold, and I moved to a quiet, anonymous villa on the coast. Clara and Elias are currently serving their enormous, decades-long sentences, and the media has long since stopped caring about the fallen empire of the Baker tycoon. People love a story about a massive fall from grace, but they never bother to look at the woman standing in the center of the ruins. I watch the tide come in every morning, a free woman with a fortune that is finally, truly, my own. My children learned the hard way that you cannot steal a crown from a queen who is willing to burn her own kingdom to the ground just to keep it from your reach. The surprise wasn't that I was powerful. The surprise was that I was the only person in the room who understood the cost of survival. I paid the price, and I am the only one left to enjoy the view.